Across the shadowed history of old terror, a single title surfaces again and again like a cracked seal rising through layers of forgotten sediment, the Sigillite. The imperial records describe Malcador using that name as if it belonged naturally to him, as if it were simply an office created in the emperor's new order. But older texts, damaged archive fragments, and half-erased mechanicum annotations whisper something different. They call the Sigillite an order, not a man, an order far older than the Imperium, an order that survived Old Night, an order that may reach back into the final centuries of the dark age of technology itself. Canon tells us only that they were guardians of knowledge too dangerous to share, custodians of sealed vaults and forbidden archives. But the deeper one digs, the clearer the implication becomes. The Sigillites were not merely librarians, they were wardens, watchers stationed across the millennia to keep certain truths from ever touching the light again. Who were they? Why did they endure when civilizations burned and empires turned to ash? And why did the emperor, in all his wisdom and might, choose a Sigillite, not a legionary, not a primarch, not a custodian, as his closest advisor and the keeper of humanity's most terrible secrets? To begin answering these questions, we must go back before Malcador's rise, back before the Unification Wars, back into the time when terror itself was fractured by fire and storm, and the Sigillites first carved their oaths into the bones of a dying world. Some fragmentary mechanicum data slates hint that the Sigillites began not as mystics or scholars, but as survivors of the last great schism of the Dark Age, the moment when mankind's machines turned against their makers, and the first men of iron began their purges. These proto-Sigillites were said to be archivists pressed into service by warlords who needed someone capable of reading the sealed code locks of pre-fall vaults. But even in these early sources, there is a tone of fear surrounding them. They were the ones who knew, individuals who understood that certain technologies, certain weapons, and certain machine intelligences could not simply be destroyed. They had to be contained, monitored, and remembered so that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. These early seal-bearers were likely wanderers then, drifting from shattered city-state to city-state as Old Night deepened. They bartered knowledge for safe passage, traded identification codes for food and shelter, and used their lore of ancient systems to broker uneasy peace between fractured human enclaves. But for every vault they locked, another opened. For every system they convinced a warlord to bury, another would be resurrected by desperate hands. And slowly, almost inevitably, these scattered keepers began to find one another. In hidden meeting places, dead metro stations, collapsed orbital hangars, sealed data crypts, buried beneath sand, they formed the beginnings of a network, a loose, secretive league devoted not to progress, but to containment. Some of this is conjecture, drawn from contradictory records, but the patterns align too neatly to ignore. Long before Malcador, there was already a tradition of humans who carried seals, keys, sigils of authority, granting access to knowledge no single nation should possess. A lineage of watchers who understood that the worst threats to humanity were not aliens or monsters, but the relics of its own forgotten brilliance. As the age of strife deepened, these proto-Sigillites changed. They were no longer simply archivists or wanderers keeping seals on dangerous knowledge. They became interventionists, stepping into conflicts not to lead armies but to shape outcomes from the shadows. Some texts recovered from Himalayan sublevels, origin uncertain, describe grey-cloaked arbiters who appeared before rising warlords with warnings, bargains, or veiled threats. They offered ancient atmospheric filters to one tribe if it would abandon a gene-forging program. They sabotaged the reactors of another whose leader sought communion with warp entities. These accounts are speculative, but they reflect a pattern. The seal-bearers acted to limit extremes, pruning the most catastrophic branches of human ambition so that the species might survive its own madness. By this period, their symbol, the broken circle around a closed sigil, had become recognized across Terra's fractured polities. Some feared it, others despised it. A few even sought to kill the ones who carried it. But the Sigillites to-be did not fight open battles. They worked in the places no one else looked. The ruins beneath irradiated cities, the coastal vaults swallowed by rising seas, the forgotten machine shrines where pre-fall databanks still whispered to those who could decipher them. They learned to operate in secrecy because the alternative was annihilation. Any open attempt to gather or centralize forbidden knowledge would have drawn the fury of techno-barbarians, warp-touched warlords, or the remnants of the men of iron still lurking in the dark places of the world. In these centuries, something else began to crystallize, a whispered belief that one day a ruler might rise who could unify Terra, and that such a figure would need an order capable of shepherding humanity's buried past. If the emperor had a predecessor in myth, it was not a king or a conqueror, but the idea that somewhere, someone would need to hold the keys to everything mankind had forgotten and everything it feared to remember. This belief, half prophecy, half practical preparation, set the stage for the Sigillites' evolution from scattered keepers into a hidden brotherhood, awaiting the arrival of a power great enough to use their knowledge without succumbing to it. When the emperor finally revealed himself and began his long campaign to reclaim Terra, the seal-bearers were ready. They recognized him not because of prophecy fulfilled, but because he alone seemed to understand the peril of unbounded knowledge. While other warlords sought weapons, gene tech, or warp bargains, he sought control, discipline, and the reconstruction of human purpose. Many of the proto-Sigillites approached him willingly. Others he found in ruins and convinced through quiet conversation rather than force. A few resisted, old men and women who had survived too much to kneel again. But even they eventually yielded, not to his power, but to his clarity. He did not ask for their loyalty, only their stewardship. It was at this moment, after the Night of Seven Fires, according to later administratum speculation, that the emperor formalized them into the Sigillite order, charging them with a monumental task: to gather every fragment of humanity's forgotten heritage and seal away anything too catastrophic to ever be used again. This was not censorship. It was a bulwark against the madness that had once torn the world apart. The vaults beneath the imperial palace began to fill with weapons that could unmake continents, recovered AI protocols, warp anchoring experiments from the Dark Age, and genetic sequences outlawed even by the emperor himself. From this crucible emerged their most enigmatic member, the man history calls Malcador the Sigillite. According to some sources, he was appointed the first lord of the order and became the emperor's closest ally, a being of immense psychic power, will, and subtlety. Beyond that, everything else becomes speculation. Some whispered he had lived since the old night, others that he had once been a warlord who laid down his empire when he saw the emperor rise. Horus himself believed that Malcador had carried more than one name across centuries, each abandoned like a shed skin when its time passed. Whether any of this is true is impossible to confirm, but his influence within the order shaped its culture: quiet, absolute dedication, obedience without blindness, and a willingness to bear the weight of truths too dangerous for the Imperium at large. The later millennia of the Sigillites' hidden history are defined by silence, not absence, but deliberate erasure. As the unification wars spiraled into their later, bloodier stages, the order operated in the shadows behind the emperor's grand project. While thunder warriors shattered the tyrants of Pan-Pacifica and the Nordic wastes burned under chemical fire, the Sigillites were elsewhere, quietly removing relics that could ignite the age of strife all over again. They confiscated warp-saturated artifacts from corpse-shrouded shrines, purged databanks left behind by defeated technocrats, and sealed away entire biolabs whose creations had outlived their makers. Their work was not glorious, but it was essential. They were the invisible hand cleaning behind the visible fist. Some scholars have long speculated that the Sigillites were the emperor's insurance policy, not merely librarians or curators, but fail-safes. If the master of mankind fell in battle during unification, the Sigillites would have held the knowledge needed to preserve his dream or bury it safely. This is speculation, but a compelling one. Their archives were deeper, older, and far more heavily protected than any other human institution of the age. It is even possible that some Sigillites knew fragments of the emperor's earliest plans, details he shared with no general, primarch, or later imperial official. By the time the primarchs were found, and the Great Crusade surged outward into the stars, the Order had already become what Imperials later assumed it always was, a graveyard of forbidden knowledge, guarded by men and women who understood exactly why such knowledge must remain buried. Their symbols appeared carved into vault doors on conquered worlds. They collected and contained early signs of chaos infection. They liaised with the navigator houses, the Mechanicum, and the nascent Inquisition in spirit, centuries before any of these bodies understood their own future roles. They were the protectors of history and the preservers of the future.